Ghostwire Tokyo comes from the same brilliant minds that made my 2023 Game of the Year. At least it will be for the next few weeks. The game has just received the Spiders Thread update, which brings new enemies, new moves, and an entire new mode. And to cap it off, you can play the game right now on both Gamepass and as part of the PlayStation Plus Extra Games catalogue. We're taking a look at the game on Xbox Series S. This review will be spoiler free, and we cover a new game every single week. So if you like the video, consider subscribing. And with that, we're getting ethereal and letting you know if Ghostwire Tokyo is worth your time. After Hi-Fi Rush was basically a perfect gameplay experience, I was itching to jump into Ghostwire, and unfortunately, I was let down. At a base level, the game is satisfying, but by hour 2, the whole loop was getting very repetitive. The central core of the game is that you use ethereal weaving to defeat enemies and explore Tokyo after a weird afterlife event occurs. It's somehow a more generic open world than Ubisoft would put out. Towers are mandatory as they open up new areas of the map for you to explore. Side quests don't have a lot of depth, even if they do tell fun tales, and there is loads of stuff for you to run around and collect. The package as a whole isn't bad, everything here is competently designed, but the whole game feels painfully mediocre. Combat feels fun, but lacks depth. You have free spells with charge abilities that can be upgraded via the skill tree, and a backup bow and arrow. I like the idea of knocking enemies down to finish them off with a cool move, but doing this stops combat dead in its tracks, yet is so powerful that it almost feels like a necessity. We've not got the fluidity of the Doom finishers here. I do like that killing enemies gives you back health and magic points, but you can also get them from glitched objects in the world. My only gripe here is that enemies don't give you a lot back, and having to run around looking for world objects slows the pace of combat once again. Also, if you run out of a certain spell, you don't auto-swap past it. So you could be in a fight and try to attack, only to find out that you've run out of magic. Enemies also don't have much variety in attacks. They either run at you, or they run at you and hit you with something, or they stay away from you and shoot you with something. Fights never felt very dynamic, but rather stale. You use your fire spell to deal large areas of effect damage, then you get in close with the water spell to do a lot of close quarters damage, before picking off the stragglers with the wind spell. The skill tree just makes each spell better, rather than branching the spells out in interesting ways. Exploring Tokyo is massively helped by solid art direction, which we'll get onto later, but as a gameplay mechanic, it feels very linear and flat. The world opens up as you complete story quests, which is a neat mechanic, but whilst it makes narrative sense, it begs the question of why this was an open world in the first place. We also have the standard dumping of icons on the map. This doesn't encourage me to explore, it just feels like a checklist. There was an interesting section at the beginning of the game where once you get used to having your powers, they are taken away from you for 10 minutes. Because the gameplay goes from bare bones to dust in the wind at this point. You are stripped of your spells and can only use your bow and arrow. It was a great section to make me really miss the spells, until I realised I could literally just run past everything without too much hassle. In the next part, the game did decide that I had to kill all of the enemies in the area, but it just turned into run around and look for arrows because my bow can only hold 10 of the things. Ultimately, the entire section just fell flat on its face. The Spiders Thread mode attempts to condense the game into a roguelike with some permanent progression elements thrown in, and this was better, but not a vast improvement. I like the idea to have optional objectives and varying floors, but just like the base game, it all felt a little undercooked, because these mechanics are just not being expanded upon. Simply put, I was just never very engaged. Nothing was badly designed, but it all just felt a bit soulless. None of the ideas here are pushing any boundaries or doing anything really new. When you start, this is fine, but what's knocking the gameplay score down to a 2 out of 5 is just how repetitive everything gets, and just how fast that tedium sets in.
Where am I? Am I dead?
If you're coming, Stay for the sights. This game looks gorgeous. Tokyo is simply mesmerising, with bright neon lights, condensed urban environments, and even otherworldly weather. It was always a joy to simply look around, and I was excited to explore the next area. Environment design in terms of gameplay isn't perfect, as it was sometimes a bit of a search to find where I needed to go, but it certainly always looked good. Enemy design is also great. Everything here is nice and distinct, and I love the choice to pull from Japanese folklore to design these guys. The enemies definitely fall under creepy rather than scary, but they are all animated wonderfully and feel decently unsettling. Even the hot vampire lady from Resident Evil 8 is here. Enemies do unfortunately have a habit of blending into the environment sometimes, especially these flying guys. It wasn't the biggest issue in the world, but it was noticeable enough to comment on. One issue that was gameplay affecting is that outside of this animation, it can be quite difficult to actually see if you've killed an enemy. There were plenty of times where I'd think they were dead for good, only for them to rematerialize. Character animations are top tier, casting spells looks awesome, as does cleansing gates and saving souls. This whole animation for yanking cores out of my enemies is simply divine. In the same vein, sound design is pretty solid all around. Souls sound like they're getting torn out, certain enemies have wonderfully creepy soundscapes, and the ambience of Tokyo is great. The OST is wonderfully Japanese inspired, but ultimately mediocre. It isn't doing anything special, and does sometimes get lost in the noise of a fight. I'd also like to make special mention of these sections that I don't really have a name for. They were great at giving the developers a chance to flex their art direction skills, and create some wonderfully dynamic set pieces. I'd also like to touch on Spirder's Thread, which takes Tokyo's great environment design and cranks it up to 11. There are no words. Menu UI is entirely functional over form, and is just fine. My only gripe here is that in the settings menu, toggles and sliders look identical. In-game UI is nice and stylized, but also very clear. It was always nice and easy to see all of the information I needed at a glance. Ultimately, the art direction here is getting a 4 out of 5. The environment, enemy, and animation design are superb, but there are enough small issues to bring the game down from that perfect score. Okay, fun's over. The narrative here is just not very good, and that sucks because the premise is super cool. You're basically just dropped into the story, and the game proceeds to do my two absolute favourite things in storytelling: tell you everything, and flashback scenes. I never cared for any of the characters because the game just did not put in the work to develop them in an interesting way. Everything is told, nothing is shown, but you are still somehow expected to care. The main character needs to save his sister, but I don't care why, because there was no relationship built up before the incident. It's just all told to you in flashback scenes. The main character is effectively a blank slate sharing a body with KK, who proceeds to state the obvious at every turn. There is no room to think, just let KK tell you everything you need to know and how you should be feeling. Twice, for good measure. The English voice acting is also pretty terrible. Everyone speaks like they're reading a school report in front of the class, and I could never get invested in the characters' emotions because they never sounded like they actually had any. Without spoilers, the only narrative saving grace here is the side quests, which have fun little tales of their own and do a solid job of fleshing out the world. But when your side quests have better writing and delivery than the main narrative thread of your game, some rethinking needs to be done. The narrative element of Ghostwire Tokyo is exceptionally weak. It's not a terrible story, but it is told in the worst possible way. Thankfully, the side quests have fun little scenarios and bring the narrative score up to a 2 out of 5. Ghostwire Tokyo is a solid content offering with lots of great settings. Unfortunately, it's not totally polished, but this may very well be a platform issue. As stated before, we played on Xbox Series S in performance mode, and I had a lot of frame stutter. I can't comment on Series X or PS5, but I have to take the game on the platform I chose to play on. And on Series S, it was rough. Outside of this, we experienced no noticeable bugs. Content-wise, you're getting a full open world to explore, filled with main quests, side quests, and lots of optional extras, including a photo mode. Additionally, you are also getting the Spider's Thread mode. The settings offered are pretty great. There are major text and audio language options. The standard audio language is Japanese, but I played in English. This did result in some unsynced animations, but it was never too jarring. You can choose autosave frequency or disable it. Camera bob strength has a slider. Time limits can be disabled and horror effects reduced. Barriers can also be shown. You can also play the game in monochrome or sepia if you like. Vibration can be enabled, and stick dead zones have separate sliders. You can enable aim assist with a few prioritization options. Each camera axis can be inverted. There are sliders for camera acceleration, deceleration, and axis sensitivity, including separate sliders for aiming and bow drawn sensitivity. You can set sprint, crouch, and glide to hold or toggle. Dodge has 3 control types. Controls can also be completely remapped. I always love to see this. Font size and subtitle font size can be scaled. Subtitles can be enabled and a background toggled. Player and game info UIs can be toggled. Minimap can be toggled, and you can lock rotation. You can also adjust minimap and minimap frame size. There is a brightness slider. There are 3 colorblind filters and a strength slider. You can choose between performance and quality mode. Film grain and chromatic aberration can be toggled. Motion blur has an intensity slider. There are sliders for master, music, sound effects, voice, and yokai volume. The specs here are getting the full 5 out of 5. You are getting a really solid package here with some great tweaks. Usually I'd come down hard on the frame drops, but performance mode does warn you about this, so it was a risk and doesn't lose any points in this instance, but it is something to be aware of. It'll take you around 10 hours to beat Ghostwire Tokyo's main story. Completion runs clock in at just over 30 hours. I think these are both solid lengths and will be easily digestible. The game is broken into 6 main chapters, which are further broken into story missions. With how friendly autosave is, it is very easy to hop in, do a few missions or some exploring, save and hop back out. Spider's Thread does the standard roguelike thing of resetting your progress on death, but there is a permanent progression system to make your time feel valued and give some decent replayability to the mode. The only gameplay related commitment issue is just how repetitive the gameplay is. My time never felt actively wasted, but it did feel like it could have been better spent on something a bit more dynamic. Hard drive footprint is also nice and reasonable. Just under 26GB on Xbox and just over 23GB on PS5. This isn't the speediest download if you have slow internet, but it's not insane and won't ask much of data caps and hard drives. I am mostly happy, and I'm giving Ghostwire Tokyo a 4 out of 5 on our commitment scale. The only thing dragging that score down is the gameplay repetition, but the game isn't out to waste your time nor clog up your hard drive. Ghostwire Tokyo is just barely worth your time. There are some interesting gameplay ideas here, but everything is very surface level and has been done before and better. The narrative is nothing special, but conversely, the art direction is top notch. So, my recommendation, come see the sights, but once that tedium sets in, it's best to hop on the plane home, rather than hoping the game will switch things up in an interesting way, because to be frank, it just won't.